On a frozen night in northern Minnesota, a retired Marine named Robert Hayes followed his aging German Shepherd, Duke, into a whiteout storm and walked straight into a scene that would change everything. Buried beneath ice and silence lay three dying German shepherds, Valor, Shadow, and Faith. They were not strays. They carried scars, discipline, and a past someone tried to erase with fire. By dawn, Robert's home would burn. By nightfall, the truth would hunt them. This is a story of loyalty forged in war, faith born in the snow, and a rescue that was never meant to succeed. Stay with us, and tell us where you're watching from. Winter swallowed Duluth in a white silence, cold pressing down on rooftops, trees, and memories with equal weight, as the wind dragged ice across the empty roads like a warning no one could escape. Robert Hayes sat alone inside a small, aging wooden cabin at the edge of the forest, where the city dissolved into shadow and pine. He was 65 years old, broad-shouldered, thick through the chest, with arms still corded with old strength, hardened by decades of labor and war. His hands were massive, scarred, knuckles permanently swollen from both rifle recoil and years of splitting frozen wood. His once black hair had faded into steel gray, cut short in a habit the military never quite releases. A trimmed silver beard framed a face deeply lined, not from age alone, but from a lifetime of watching men die. His eyes were pale blue, steady and distant, carrying the quiet weight of survival. Each morning he followed the same routine: chop wood, repair broken fence posts crushed by drifting snow, brew coffee so dark it trembled in the cup, sit by the window and watch frost crawl across the glass like living veins. Duluth moved on without him. He had not joined it. He had buried too many friends beneath flags and folded his grief into silence. The only living thing that still belonged to him was Duke. Duke was an aging German shepherd with a thick sable coat dusted with white around the muzzle and brows. His back legs had begun to stiffen with the slow cruelty of time, but his posture remained disciplined, as if duty itself still held his spine upright. His eyes were the same pale amber they had been in youth, alert and unwavering, watching the world for dangers that no longer came. Duke had served once in search and rescue training before Robert adopted him years earlier. They understood each other without sound. Two veterans of different wars, sharing one quiet exile. The fire cracked low in the hearth when Duke suddenly lifted his head. His ears snapped forward. A deep, warning growl rolled through his chest. Robert froze with his coffee halfway to his lips. The wind howled outside in violent bursts, rattling the windows like fists. Then beneath the roar of the storm, faint but unmistakable, came a sound that did not belong to wind or wood. It was thin, broken, almost human. Robert stood slowly. His joints protested with dull pain, but his reflexes moved faster than his body. He reached for his heavy coat from the chair, slipped on thick gloves, grabbed the flashlight from the old nail by the door. Duke rose beside him without command. When Robert opened the door, the storm struck like an animal, snow slamming into his face, wind tearing breath from his lungs. The forest beyond was a wall of swirling white. The sound came again, weaker now. Robert stepped into the blizzard. Each step sank deep into snow that pulled at his boots as if the earth itself were trying to keep him from whatever waited ahead. The flashlight beam cut a narrow, trembling tunnel through the storm. Duke stayed close at his left side, shoulder brushing Robert's knee, guiding him like a living compass. Then Robert saw the shadow. It was not one shape, but several, pressed into a shallow drift near a fallen tree. At first he thought the storm was playing tricks on his vision. Then the shadow moved. Robert dropped to his knees in the snow. 3 German shepherds lay tangled together under a crust of ice and frost, their bodies skeletal beneath fur stiff with frozen moisture. Their breathing came in shallow, uneven bursts, barely visible against the storm. One of them tried to lift its head and failed. Blood darkened the snow at their paws. For a moment, Robert only stared. Memories flooded in without permission. Bodies in sand, smoke, the helpless weight of wounded men in his arms, the choice between one life and another. He had not knelt like this in many years. Cold burned through his gloves as he touched the nearest dog. It was alive. Barely. He did not hesitate again. Robert lifted the largest of them first. The dog weighed far less than it should have, its body limp with exhaustion and hypothermia. Duke pressed close, whining softly. Robert turned back toward the cabin, his legs shaking under the weight and the storm fighting every step. By the time he returned with the first dog and laid it by the fire, the room smelled of wet fur and melting ice. He went back out twice more. Each trip was harder. Snow rose higher around his thighs. His lungs burned. The wind tore at his balance, but he carried them all inside. When the door finally shut behind him, the cabin felt crowded with breath and suffering. He worked through the night in silence. Towels, heat, slow drops of lukewarm water against cracked tongues. He checked their paws, their ears, their gums with hands that remembered first aid drills from another lifetime. When one of them whimpered, he murmured low, steady words without knowing what he said. Duke lay beside them, pressed close in quiet guardianship. Dawn arrived as a thin gray line through the frosted windows. By morning, they were no longer dying. Only then did Robert truly see them. All 3 were young adults, powerful even in starvation, their frames built for speed and endurance. Their coats were thick and well cared for beneath the ice damage. As Robert gently cleared the fur from the neck of the first dog, his fingers paused. There on the skin just beneath the coat was a faint, precise marking. A tattoo. He felt the breath leave his chest. He checked the second, the same mark. Then the third, a slightly smaller female with a long, straight scar running clean along her flank, too perfect to be accidental. The same tattoo rested beneath her fur as well. They were not strays. They were not abandoned pets. They were soldiers. When they grew strong enough to rise days later, Robert observed without interference. They did not wander. They positioned themselves with calculated distance. They watched windows, doors, forest line. They responded to subtle shifts in his posture, not his voice. When Duke attempted to approach too quickly, they did not snarl. They simply adjusted as a unit, calm and ready. Robert gave them names not because he needed them, but because he understood that beings who survive battles deserve identity. The leader he called Valor. The shadow at his side he named Shadow. The scarred female who never stopped listening he called Faith. That night, Robert sat alone in the firelight with Duke at his feet, and the 3 silent figures resting nearby. The cabin that had once been a refuge now felt like a barracks again. The familiar tension of vigilance returned to his bones. The war he thought he had escaped had followed him into the snow. He whispered into the quiet that no one but the dogs could hear. You were trained. You were used. You were discarded. And just like that, the ghosts he had buried in Duluth began to stir. The cabin had never felt so alive and yet so heavy with unspoken history. Fires burned day and night until the air itself seemed to pulse with heat. Robert moved between stove and hearth in a slow, steady rhythm, his massive figure silhouetted by flame and shadow, while Duke followed every step like a silent escort. Valor, Shadow, and Faith lay on layered blankets near the warmth, their breathing deepening by the hour as life slowly reclaimed its place inside their battered bodies. By the second night, they no longer trembled. By the third, they began to lift their heads when Robert passed. When his rough hands brought water, they drank without fear. When he wiped the melting snow from their coats, they did not flinch. Still, none of them slept deeply. Their bodies rested, but their minds remained on watch. Robert saw it clearly now. On the fourth morning, pale winter sunlight slipped between the frost lines of the windows. Robert knelt beside Valor and brushed the fur at the base of his ear. What he found there made his chest tighten. The tattoo was not just a mark. It was precise, uniform, faded by time but not by neglect. He examined Shadow next, and then Faith. Each bore the same symbol in the same place. The scar along Faith's flank drew his finger like a magnet. It was straight as a blade line, clean, surgical. Robert had seen wounds like this before, not on animals, on men. He sat back on his heels, breath slow, eyes distant. The smell of antiseptic and burning metal filled his memory. He saw flash frames of battlefield hospitals, of men stripped and stitched under brutal lights, of bodies treated as equipment to be repaired and sent back out. The scars on these dogs did not belong to the wild. They belonged to human hands. Later that afternoon, when he placed bowls of food near the hearth, the pattern became unmistakable. Valor ate first. Shadow remained half a step behind him, not challenging nor yielding, simply present. Faith moved last, scanning the room with ears high and muscles ready. Duke approached too quickly, and Valor shifted instantly between him and the others. There was no snarl, no bark, just calculated movement. Duke lowered his head and backed away instinctively. They were not forming a pack. They were forming a formation. Robert tested a theory without knowing why. He stood from his chair in one smooth motion. Immediately, Faith adjusted her stance. Shadow repositioned 2 steps left. Valor's eyes locked on Robert's shoulders instead of his face. He lifted one hand slightly, palm down. All 3 froze in perfect stillness. Robert's stomach clenched. This was not obedience born of hunger. This was reflex built into bone. That night, after the dogs settled back near the fire, Robert sat alone at his narrow table and poured himself a single finger of whiskey. He rarely drank anymore. Alcohol made the past too loud. But that night, the past was already screaming. He stared at his hands as if seeing them for the first time, remembering how often those hands had once guided men into danger with simple gestures. How many of those men had never followed him back out? He turned to the dogs and spoke softly. Valor lifted his head at the sound. Shadow's ears moved, but his eyes remained shut. Faith watched him with unwavering attention. "You were trained," Robert said quietly. "You were not born this way." The words tasted like iron in his mouth. Sleep came in broken fragments. Images of fire and snow and collapsing roofs tangled with the sound of labored breathing. When Robert jolted awake before dawn, Faith was already standing with her nose pressed to the door. Nothing was there, but her body remained coiled until sunrise. As the days passed, strength returned to the bodies, but not to the tension. Robert tried short, controlled walks outside the cabin line. Shadow refused to step into open ground first. Valor moved ahead with a wide arc as if clearing an unseen field. Faith swept the rear. Duke dragged behind, confused but obedient, reduced from guardian to protected. Robert felt something within him shift with each step they took together. On the seventh day, the storm returned faintly, not with violence but with reminder. Snow fell in long drifting curtains, gentle yet endless. Robert opened the window for air. Faith's ears twitched toward the wind. Shadow rose silently. Valor followed. They stood alert, gaze fixed on the forest line. Nothing moved, yet they did not relax. Robert closed the window and whispered to Duke that the danger was only weather. Duke wagged his tail uncertainly. The others did not respond. That afternoon, Robert found the courage to name what he had been avoiding. He spoke their names aloud while placing his hand on each of their heads. Valor acknowledged with a grave nod. Shadow leaned subtly into his palm. Faith did not move at all, but her breathing steadied. Naming them felt like anchoring ghosts to earth. Later that evening, Robert attempted something he had not tried in years. He opened the old cedar chest beneath his bed and lifted out a folded Marine Corps jacket. The fabric still smelled faintly of oil and salt. The insignia caught the firelight in dull gold. When he held it, his hands shook. He had not worn it since the funeral of his last platoon brother. Faith noticed first. She rose and walked slowly toward him. Her scar caught the light as she sat at his feet. There was no fear in her eyes, only recognition. Robert sank down against the bed and let the jacket fall across his knees. For the first time since the fire 10 years earlier, the sob broke free. It was not loud. It was not violent. It was the quiet shattering of something long held under armor. Shadow came next, brushing his shoulder with firm weight. Valor positioned close behind him like a living wall. Duke pressed his graying head against Robert's chest. In that moment, Robert did not feel like a man saving animals. He felt like a man being rescued by soldiers who did not know how to stop standing watch. The truth settled into him in pieces. Whatever had been done to these dogs had not ended when they escaped the storm. Whatever hunt had shaped their training might still be alive somewhere beyond these woods. But tonight, he was their shelter. Robert sat long after the fire fell to embers. The storm whispered against the cabin walls. The scars slept beside him. And for the first time since the war ended, he knew without doubt that a new battle had begun quietly in his home. Not of bullets and commands, but of memory and responsibility. 1 week after the storm loosened its grip on the forest, Robert finally had no choice but to leave his quiet refuge. Supplies were running thin. The dogs were eating steadily now, their bodies regaining mass and strength with alarming speed. Even Duke, slower with age, found his appetite doubled by the restless energy around him. The truck's engine growled reluctantly when Robert turned the key, its old metal protesting the cold like an arthritic joint. Valor jumped into the covered bed without hesitation. Shadow followed with a smooth, silent motion. Faith paused only long enough to scan the tree line before leaping in beside them. Duke took the passenger seat as always, his weight shifting carefully on the worn leather. The drive into town felt longer than usual. Snowbanks rose like frozen walls on either side of the narrow road. Robert's hands rested steady on the wheel, but his eyes moved constantly between mirrors and tree line. He told himself it was only instinct left over from war. He told himself it meant nothing. The grocery store in Duluth sat on the corner of a tired brick block, its windows fogged with heat and human breath. The moment Robert stepped inside, conversation thinned. Heads turned, eyes dropped. The three shepherds waited in the truck, but their presence was felt like thunder behind glass. Robert moved methodically through the aisles, loading sacks of dry food, canned meat, medical supplies. He felt the weight of being observed settle on his shoulders like a coat he could not remove. He was bent over a shelf of dog food when the shadow fell across the floor. A man stood at his side, tall and broad, but beginning to thicken around the middle with age. His uniform was crisp in a way that suggested it was worn more for authority than for labor. His hair was dark brown, streaked with silver at the temples, neatly parted. A trimmed mustache framed a mouth that smiled too easily. His eyes were pale and watchful, set in a face that had learned to hide intention behind politeness. William Carter extended a hand. Sheriff of Duluth. Robert accepted the handshake. Carter's grip was firm but oddly tentative, as if testing something unseen. He spoke lightly, his voice smooth. "You've got quite a pack out there. Folks aren't used to seeing that many big dogs at once." "Found them in the storm," Robert replied. Carter nodded as if the answer amused him. He glanced toward the window where Valor's silhouette moved faintly behind frosted glass. "If they're rescue animals, there are some forms you'll need to fill out. Just standard procedure." The tone was gentle, the look was not. His gaze returned to Robert's face, searching for something that did not show. "I'll take care of it," Robert said. Carter's smile tightened by a fraction of an inch. He stepped back, giving Robert room as if nothing had happened. But when he turned away, his eyes lingered on the shackles of supply stacked in Robert's cart. Across the street. Through the narrow, steamed window of a small corner cafe, Mary Thompson watched the exchange unfold. She sat alone at a table near the glass, a chipped mug of black tea cupped between long, pale fingers. Mary was in her early 50s, tall and slender with narrow shoulders and a straight posture that hinted at years spent leaning over desks and chasing deadlines. Her hair was a muted chestnut shot through with silver, pulled back into a low practical bun. Her skin carried the faint lines of a life lived indoors under deadlines and fluorescent lights rather than sun. Her eyes were sharp gray and rarely still. She had once been one of the most relentless investigative reporters in the Midwest. That had ended after a story she refused to bury cost powerful people their comfort. The paper called it budget cuts. The truth had been simpler. Since then, she wrote community pieces that paid the bills and dulled the edge of her instincts. Until that moment. Mary recognized a lie the way others recognized a melody. What she saw between Robert and Carter was not friendliness. It was measurement. The dogs in the truck sat unnaturally still. No barking, no pacing. That alone was wrong. Robert exited the store moments later. Carter lingered inside, speaking softly to the clerk while watching Robert through the glass. Mary followed Robert's figure with her eyes as he loaded the truck and drove away. Then she turned her attention back to the sheriff, who pretended not to notice her watching. 3 days passed quietly. Too quietly. On the 4th afternoon, Mary drove into the foothills where the forest thickened and the houses thinned. She followed directions pieced together from overheard conversations and old town memory. The cabin appeared through the trees like a held breath. Weathered wood, smoke from the chimney, tire tracks half buried by fresh snow. Faith sensed her first. The female shepherd rose from the porch with a low, warning growl. Valor stepped forward beside her. Shadow positioned off to the side, invisible until he moved. Duke barked once from inside. Robert opened the door moments later. He stood in the frame with arms crossed, his broad chest blocking half the light. He studied Mary without aggression but with guarded assessment. Mary stopped a respectful distance from the steps. "My name is Mary Thompson. I saw you in town." Robert said nothing. "I used to be a reporter," she added quietly. The dogs did not relax. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she continued. "I'm here because I think someone already is." Robert weighed her words against the world he had just re-entered. Something in her eyes, too steady to be dishonest, made him step aside. Inside the cabin, Mary's gaze moved across scars of old life slowly. The fire-blackened stones, the heavy table worn by years of solitary meals, the marine jacket folded beneath glass in a frame on the wall. Her attention shifted to the dogs positioned like sentries around the room. "They move like soldiers," she said. Robert's throat tightened. She did not press further. Tea was poured. Silence stretched. "I once chased a story about a training facility down south," Mary said at last. "Animals used the way men are used. When the funding disappeared, so did the witnesses." A few months later, 3 handlers died in separate accidents. The story never ran. Robert's eyes hardened. "I saw the way that Sheriff looked at your dogs." "That was not curiosity," Mary said. "That was recognition." Outside, an engine sound drifted faintly through the trees and faded again. Faith's ears lifted. Valor moved to the door. Shadow disappeared into blind corners of the room. Robert looked at Mary. For the first time, doubt was not alone inside his chest. "If you're right," he said quietly, "then they're not done with us." Mary met his gaze. "I don't think they ever started." They said no more that afternoon. When Mary left, the forest closed in behind her. Robert stood long after she disappeared from sight. The cabin no longer felt separate from the world. It felt marked. That night, Robert did not sleep. Neither did the dogs. The forest changed its rhythm after Mary's visit. Robert felt it first in the air. The stillness that once meant peace now carried weight, like a held breath waiting to break. Snow continued to fall in soft layers, erasing yesterday's tracks. Yet each morning, Robert found new ones where none should be. Tire grooves appeared at the edge of the tree line and vanished again beneath fresh powder. Duke's ears rose at sounds Robert could not yet name. Valor stood longer at the porch rail. Shadow disappeared into darkness and returned without sound. Faith slept light, her eyes opening at the faintest shift of wind. Robert did not speak his suspicion aloud. He did not need to. The dogs already lived it. 3 nights after Mary left, Robert heard movement behind the cabin near the old woodshed. It was not the scurry of animals. It was deliberate and cautious. He reached for the rifle that had remained untouched behind the door for years. His hands found its weight with ease that unsettled him. When he stepped outside, the snow lay fresh and unbroken. Whatever had been there had already learned how to leave without a trace. The following evening, the wind dropped entirely. The moon did not rise. Even the forest seemed to hold itself in restraint. Robert slept with his boots beside the bed and the rifle leaned against the wall. The smell woke him first. Smoke crept into the room with unnatural gentleness, thin as breath against his throat. Before his eyes opened fully, Valor was already there, teeth gripping the sleeve of Robert's flannel shirt, pulling with relentless force. Shadow crashed into the door with brutal urgency. Faith's bark cut through the dark, sharp and commanding. Duke stumbled from his corner with a startled growl. Robert sprang from the bed as the first explosion of sound shattered the porch. The front of the cabin bloomed into flame with terrifying speed. Heat rolled inward like a living wall. The door would not move when Shadow struck it again. Robert moved toward the rifle by instinct and then hesitated. The ceiling groaned above him as fire ate through old beams faster than reason allowed. A heavy timber cracked free and fell where he had stood seconds earlier. Shadow slammed his full weight into Robert's side, driving him backward. Faith hooked her jaws into Duke's thick fur and dragged him across the floor. Valor charged through the back hall and crashed headlong into the thin window frame. The glass shattered outward into the snow. Cold air rushed in like salvation. Robert pushed Duke through first. The old shepherd tumbled into snow and rolled to his feet, shaking. Faith followed in a blur of motion. Shadow leapt next, landing and turning instantly to guard. Valor remained inside for a heartbeat too long, searching for Robert. When the ceiling collapsed, Robert threw himself forward, and Shadow hit him from behind with enough force to send him through the opening. The fire swallowed the room behind them with a roar that sounded like an animal released. They fell into the snow together. Robert lay on his back, staring into the burning skeleton of what had been his home. Flames climbed into the roof and tore through the pattern of his life with merciless precision. The photographs died first, then the framed uniform, then the quiet corner where Duke had slept for years. Robert dropped to his knees in the snow and pulled Duke into his arms. The old dog trembled violently, his breath a ragged cloud against Robert's chest. Valor, Shadow, and Faith stood around them, forming an unbroken half-circle of muscle and vigilance. Snow fell softly into the fire, as if trying to forgive what had just happened. For the first time in more than 30 years, Robert cried. He did not howl. He did not shout. His shoulders shook with silent, uncontrollable convulsions, as the weight he had carried since war finally found release in the only place it could fall without shame. Someone had come for them, not for his land, not for his life, for the dogs. The fire burned until nothing stood but blackened ribs of timber and steaming ruin. By the time dawn touched the horizon with pale light, Robert rose slowly from the snow with eyes emptied of tears and filled instead with something harder. A truck approached as the smoke thinned. Its engine moved cautiously through the road drifts. Robert raised the rifle and lowered it only when he recognized the driver. Jonah Miller stepped out into the cold with both hands visible. He was in his late 20s, tall and lean with narrow shoulders that had not yet learned the weight of authority. His brown hair was cut short, but without precision, and a faint scar ran along his cheek from a winter rollover years earlier. Jonah had grown up in this town. He had once been pulled from a frozen river as a boy by visiting Marines during a training operation. He never forgot it. The uniform he wore now did not yet fit his soul comfortably. "Robert Hayes," Jonah said quietly. "I saw the smoke from town." Robert did not answer. Jonah's gaze shifted over the ruins, then to the 4 dogs standing guard. Understanding dawned in his eyes with a slow tightening of dread. "This was no accident," Jonah said. Robert met his eyes. "No, it was not." Jonah hesitated only a moment. Then he opened the back of his truck and removed blankets and a thermos. He approached slowly, allowing the dogs to read his intention before he closed the distance. Valor permitted it. "There is a ranger station north of here," Jonah said. "It's been closed for years. Off the maps. No one goes there." Robert considered the direction without looking. "It will shelter you until this stops," Jonah added. "Until this ends," Robert corrected. They left the ruins behind as the sun climbed higher into a winter sky that pretended nothing had changed. Snow covered evidence as if obeying orders. By the time they reached the abandoned station near noon, the forest had already begun to erase the crime. The building stood crooked beneath tall pines, its windows dark with dust and long sleep. Inside, the cold was absolute. Faith searched first, her nose tracing secrets of old human presence across broken boards. She stopped at one place near the back wall and pawed with patient insistence. Robert lifted the floor panel and found a metal container buried beneath. Its weight told him before his hands touched it that the truth inside was not light. The fire had not come out of silence. It had come out of fear. And now fear had left its shadow behind. The ranger station had not seen light in many years, and when Robert pried open the rusted container Faith had uncovered beneath the floorboards, the beam of his flashlight revealed not gold or weapons, but stacks of paper bound with brittle clips and a small black data drive sealed in plastic. The room seemed to tighten around them, as if the walls themselves were listening. Jonah stood near the door with his hand resting on his holster out of nervous habit, his youthful face strained and pale beneath the fluorescent glare of the emergency lamp he had rigged to the battery of his truck. Mary knelt beside Robert, her long fingers already trembling with the instinct she had tried to silence for years. She was not the weary journalist who had walked into the forest days earlier. She was once again the woman who had chased truth at personal cost. They worked in silence at first. Robert spread the documents across an old wooden table scarred by decades of neglect. Mary sorted through them with methodical precision. Training logs, transport manifests, veterinary reports stamped with a private contractor's name that had never officially existed. And then the line that made Jonah inhale sharply through his teeth. Decommissioning authorized. 3 units lost in transit during winter relocation. Assets presumed destroyed. Mary read it again, slowly, aloud. Robert did not need to hear the rest to understand. Valor, Shadow, and Faith had not escaped by accident. They had survived execution. The dogs lay nearby, their bodies relaxed for the first time since the fire. But Faith lifted her head at the sound of her name. Her eyes followed the trembling edge in Mary's voice. Mary did not publish immediately. She knew too well what happened when truth ran faster than proof. Instead, she called an old contact from her investigative years, a man named Harold Baines, a private forensic archivist in Minneapolis who specialized in reconstructing erased data trails. Harold was in his late 60s with a hunched back and white curls that always escaped the shape of his knit cap. He had once been a federal records analyst before resigning after a classified cover-up nearly destroyed his family. He answered Mary's call with weary skepticism that turned into stunned silence when she sent him the first scanned images. "Give me 48 hours," Harold said finally. "Do not let anyone know you have that drive." Jonah drove the data to him under cover of night, returning before dawn with snow caked to his boots and fear heavy behind his eyes. 2 days later, the truth detonated quietly. When Mary's article went live, it did not lead with flames or heroics. It led with names, contractors, budgets, internal authorizations, a hidden canine weapons program disguised through a web of small shell companies, canceled funding, missing assets, and one town sheriff listed repeatedly as the regional containment liaison. By mid-morning, federal investigators were on the road to Duluth. By noon, William Carter was placed on administrative leave. By evening, he was in handcuffs. Robert did not attend the arrest. He remained at the ranger station with the dogs while the forest absorbed the sound of distant sirens. He watched their reactions carefully, and for the first time since the storm, they did not move to defensive formation. They simply watched him. The trial unfolded slowly over months, not in gunfire, but in testimony. Former trainers whose lives had been buried beneath non-disclosure agreements stepped forward. One of them was a woman named Sarah Keller, tall and wiry with ash-blonde hair cut short at the jaw and a sun-browned face lined by grief. She had once overseen medical recovery for canine units and had walked away when ordered to euthanize animals that still responded to her voice. Her hands shook when she spoke. Her voice did not. The evidence did what weapons could not. It dismantled lies piece by piece. Robert testified once, only once. He spoke of the fire, of the dogs, of what it meant to be trained for loyalty and then discarded. He did not embellish. He did not accuse. He told the truth with the same calm precision that had once guided men into battle. The courtroom fell silent when he finished. Justice arrived not with thunder, but with signatures. Years of prison sentences, confiscated assets, quiet apologies that could never repay what had been stolen. Money followed soon after. Donations poured in from strangers who had never seen the forest or the snow or the scars, yet felt the shape of the story in their chests. Robert refused the first offers, then the second. Only when Mary reminded him that the funds were not for him, but for the ghosts he had taken into his care, did he agree. He did not rebuild the cabin. Instead, he purchased a narrow stretch of land beyond the southern edge of Duluth, where the forest opened into pale rolling ground and the river moved slow and steady beneath winter ice. Jonah helped clear brush on weekends. Sarah came north to assist with veterinary planning. Even Harold arrived once, standing stiff in the cold as if unsure how truth ever turned warm again. They built not a shelter, but a sanctuary. Fences wide enough for running, heated kennels with low light and quiet walls. A small house with a long porch, where Robert took his coffee in the mornings with Duke resting against his knee. The dogs learned new habits slowly. Valor learned how to drop his guard without losing his dignity. Shadow learned the unfamiliar luxury of play. Faith learned that silence no longer meant danger. Duke grew older at their side, no longer guardian but storyteller of warmth. On the first winter evening after the sanctuary opened, snow fell gently across the land, with none of the violence that had once arrived with it. Robert sat on the porch, wrapped in a thick wool coat. Duke lay beside him, breathing deep and slow. Valor, Shadow, and Faith ran across the open field together, in widening circles beneath the fading sky, no longer clearing threats, only chasing the long echo of freedom. Mary stood nearby with her camera lowered. She did not take the photograph. She chose to keep the moment for herself. Robert watched the dogs until the sun slipped behind the hills and the cold grew again. Then he placed his hand on Duke's gravely head and spoke without bitterness for the first time in decades. "War does not give back what it takes," he said quietly. "But sometimes it gives us a way forward." The fire had taken his home. The truth had given him a future. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder or flashing skies. Sometimes they come in silence, carried on 4 tired paws through deep snow, or in the steady hands of an old soldier who refuses to turn away from suffering. God did not stop the storm for Robert. He did something far greater. He sent help through loyalty, courage, and love when it was needed most. In our own lives, we may not face burning cabins or hidden enemies, but we face quiet battles every day. Loneliness, fear, regret, doubt. And yet, in ways we often do not recognize at first, God still places miracles in our path. A faithful companion, a stranger who shows up at the right moment, a second chance when we thought our story was already over. This story reminds us that no matter how long the winter lasts, God is still at work beneath the snow. Healing may come slowly, Justice may take time, but faith, when held with patience, is never wasted. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to share it with someone who may be walking through their own storm. Please leave a comment below and tell us what this story meant to you. And if you believe, as we do, that hope still lives in this world, please consider subscribing to our channel so we can continue sharing stories of faith, courage, and quiet miracles. May God bless you, protect your family, bring peace to your home, and guide your steps through every season of life. Amen.